Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at VeggieDiplomat. Hello and welcome to episode 37 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor after a brief hiatus. We are excited to be back and eager to talk about a variety of new topics. Before we begin our episode, our hearts and prayers are with the Ukrainian people who are facing a massive Russian onslaught. The destruction being witnessed now speaks of a great humanitarian tragedy that Ukraine can ill afford at this critical hour. Today, obviously, we are going to look at the most burning issue in geopolitics right now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, we will be jumping back and forth on lots of issues pertaining to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what we plan to do right away is to look at the Indian abstention in the United Nations. So once the Russian onslaught started, there was a flurry of activity both in Europe and other world capitals. The United Nations promptly convened and voted to condemn the Russian actions. In fact, ambassadors from various European nations and the Ukrainian ambassador to India, Mr. Igor Polilka, tried to generate support for Ukraine in the corridors of power in New Delhi. However, India abstained during both the resolutions, one in the Security Council and one in the General Assembly, placing them together with China. India's ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Tirumurti, issued a clarification after it abstained, but it actually looked like an explainer as to why it was supposed to vote in favor of Ukraine. So things did not add up from an Indian perspective, but we'll look again deeply into the dichotomy that India faces. But now we'll switch back to the Russian gamble in the Donbas region. Now, we all know that there was a military buildup for months across the Ukrainian border, and there were also military exercises with the Belarusian armed forces. In fact, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, traveled to Moscow and tried to get some kind of concessions from Putin. And there was a decoy when Putin announced a pullback of the troops and also published some videos and pictures. However, we all know that it was a decoy. Now, there is an agreement called the Minsk Agreement of 2014, which had actually given a temporary reprieve for Kiev in controlling the two rebel regions in the Donbas region. The two regions are Luhansk and Donetsk. But since then, approximately about 14,000 people have lost their lives to the fighting in the greater Donbas region. This time around, Putin went ahead and exercised a very less risky option of recognizing the two autonomous regions as sovereign republics. So, Mohal, when Russia was gambling on declaring these two republics as sovereign, it kind of mirrored a similar operation that Russia had performed over the Georgian territory in late 2008. Do you want to shed light on that?
Yeah, so in 2008, in Georgia, which is another of the former Soviet republics, during the Bucharest summit of the NATO, they had basically indicated that they would welcome someday like Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Now, while Georgia and Ukraine were happy at this outcome, Russia was not too pleased. Now, using the pretext of Georgian forces targeting pro-Russian province of South Ossetia, that's a province on the border of Russia and Georgia, Russia marched in wanting not only to secure South Ossetia but also push further into throw back the Georgian troops, which was directed by their then President Mikhail Saakashvili. Sorry, I am can't get the spelling right. So the Georgian army succumbed in quick time and retreated towards their capital. Now the Russian army marched forward to seize the capital, but the stayed just outside the capital for a bit. Back then, the French convinced in both the parties to hastily exit ceasefire, while Putin wanted Mikhail out. The Bush administration, with help of current President Joe Biden, arranged a financial rescue package. Eventually, there was a ceasefire between Georgia and Russia, and Putin relented on his demands. The President Saakashvili remained in power until he was voted out of office in 2012, eventually leading to a peaceful transfer of power. Now, the Georgian war, like it would be like what 14 years ago,
Mhm.
showcased like Putin's willingness to start a war to force a country to stay within the so-called Russian sphere of influence. He relented when he was assured that Georgia wouldn't be joining NATO. Similarly, Putin annexed Crimea when a pro-Russian president was thrown out of office in Ukraine during the Euromaidan protest in 2014.
Yeah. So, what we see from the Georgian example is Putin is willing to throw his might and directly attack the neighbor and try to get assurances that the country would not join NATO, and also in the process break that country into smaller pieces, and whatever autonomous regions Putin can grab hold of, they would be declared as sovereign republics. And that is quite similar to what Putin has done even now. Okay, so we will now look at the actual invasion that Putin ordered into the heart of Ukraine. In fact, last year in July 2021, Putin published a strange pseudo historical essay titled On the Historic Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. This essentially saying that the independence of Ukraine is a historical anomaly. Now, in February, just before the planned special military operation that Putin wants to call it, Putin made a speech which was closely watched by everyone around the world. In that speech, he spoke about the historical wrongs of how Crimea was given away to Ukraine by the Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. He also said that Ukraine had no history of legitimate statehood. He added that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, it is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. And he warned, telling, history is destiny, and Ukraine will never get away from Russia. And immediately after that, he followed with a three pronged attack, one from the north, one from the east, and one from south. And he called it as the special military operation intended for demilitarization and deNazification of Ukraine. But the question remained, why did Putin attack now? What triggered now? What triggered the attack now? And it's kind of uh, quite obvious that Putin fundamentally misread the situation. But he saw this as a great opportunity. Why? Because he considered that the American administration had lost quite a bit of credibility after Afghanistan and had been signaling little interest in opposing him in Ukraine. He saw a new government in Germany under Chancellor um, the new chancellor, who was both untested, and he comes from the Social Democratic Party, which is more left wing of among the major German parties, and historically wanted good German-Russian relations. He also saw that China was feeling stronger and also was more opposed to the United States of America. So this is about the kind of timing and whether or not Putin misread the situation. But then why attack at all? Why not find a diplomatic way out? Mohal, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so recently, like Dr. Paul Prost, um, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and a non-resident fellow on the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, has argued that uh, what has happened here is like more from a lens of offensive realism. Basically, it
Mm-hmm.
says that any country, especially like great powers, it always wants to dominate its region and make sure that no other country dominates this region. Now, this offensivism, I mean, we also saw it in the past where in the 1800s, I believe, like there was a Monroe Doctrine where where it dictated that US wanted to have the Americas, the North and the South America, as its own sphere of influence and didn't want anyone to interfere there. So the offensive realism is like basically was a way for Russia to safeguard their own interests in their neighborhood. Now there were two choices, and uh, basically what happened is either like we tell like Ukraine to accept neutrality because otherwise the Russians are going to invade and we are not fighting. This is what like Henry Kissinger proposed back as far back I think it is 2014. So the goal is either you have to arm the Ukraine sufficiently that they can deter the Russians, or like fight on their behalf, which is not happening. I think like many American presidents have a role on where the situation has evolved today. Obviously, Russia bears the blame for starting the military conflict. There's no doubt about it. But I think the thing started to roll from the Bucharest summit in 2008, where Ukraine was first promised like a NATO membership down the road. Now, at that time, basically that was under George Bush, but also like under President Obama, they didn't sell a lot of weapons to Ukraine to arm itself. And also we saw that in Syria, like President Obama had put a sort of a red line, which they asked their opponents to not cross, which they did, and they didn't do anything, And then like Neil Ferguson like recently said that and I quote, the consequences of this are far reaching indeed. First of all, in the administration's laxity to avoid even higher inflation, they are desperately trying to resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal and get the Iranian oil back in the world market, and in the process making all kinds of concessions that will come back to haunt them. So this is the place where to isolate Russia, they're trying to reach out to Ukraine. Sorry, they're trying to reach out to Iran to balance the energy market, but this is not going to end well.
Mm-hmm.
Kishore?
Okay, great. Okay, so once Russia invaded and Ukraine was kind of left all alone, the Western world, including the US, they kind of acted hastily and started imposing sanctions. And that is what we're going to look at next. And EU, the European Union, the US, and its major allies like Japan, South Korea, almost everybody started imposing economic sanctions on Russia. The biggest move, as everybody knows by now, was to block a Russian ability to use the SWIFT banking system. Reportedly, two-thirds of Russian central bank reserves have been frozen, which is quite a lot because Russia, by latest count, had around $680 billion. And if two-thirds of it is frozen, that would easily be around, say, around say 420 billion dollars, and that's quite a bit of money. Now, along with that, the Russian flights were barred from entering the European airspace, and foreign exchange as we already pointed out, that were stored in various vaults around the world were frozen, and this started escalating and started expanding to newer dimensions. Sporting bodies, for instance, started imposing their own sanctions. The UEFA Champions League final was pushed out of St. Petersburg, uh, which was where it was planned to be held. Now, Russian athletes in various sports like tennis, Paralympics were told that you can play but without your national identities. Giant tech corporations like Apple, Microsoft announced that they won't be selling their new line of products in Russia. Moreover, Apple joined MasterCard and Visa in stopping their Apple Pay services within Russia. And quickly after that, even Google followed suit by suspending their Google Pay services. Surely, the West kept scaring Putin prior to the attack that Russia will face never seen before sanctions if it was to invade Ukraine. So Putin was kind of aware of the impact of sanctions on Russia, and to an extent, he would have been prepared to soften the blow. But the enormity of the sanctions that were imposed would have surely taken Putin off guard. However, apart from sanctions, Putin also was made to contend with condemnation pretty much from every corner of the world, including his own backyard. Hungary, Czech Republic, Kazakhstan all either condemned Russia's action or refused Russia's request for troops to attack Ukraine. Now, as things unfold, there are other neighbors like Finland, Sweden, who are now finding new purpose in trying to join NATO as a direct response to Russian bullying tactics. For starters, Sweden has now announced that it is upping its defense budget right away. Now, Bush had pointed this out to Gerhard Schroeder, the then German Chancellor, in 2002. He had informed that getting off nuclear power, that Germany getting off nuclear power meant becoming dependent on Russia for natural gas and oil. However, Gerhard Schroeder, in all his wisdom back then, didn't seem to be so bothered about it. However, now the Germans have abandoned 40 years of outreach to Russia, and which was their hallmark through Chancellor Angela Merkel's tenure. The current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has now declared a doubling of the German defense budget and also his willingness to ship weapons to Ukraine. So this is about the Western world and their imposition of sanctions and threats and so on and so forth. Mohal, I want you to talk about the China angle also and how China has been reacting to all this.
Yeah, so China, I mean, like, is been growing closer to Russia due to both their antagonism against United States, like, which is their primary rival. Now, China, even though it's like a valuable friend, it wasn't very supportive of Russian actions on the diplomatic front. On the Security Council vote, China abstained surprisingly and got its media to take an anti-Russia stand. China, on the financial side, will want to help Russia so that it doesn't collapse financially. It doesn't require a balancing factor against United States. It doesn't want to be isolated. It is the sole power who is trying to fight against the United States. Um, Already, like, Russian banks have been rushing to establish credit cards with Chinese financial institutions because they have been frozen out of the Western land banking system, including the SWIFT.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Antara Ghoshal Singh, a fellow at the Strategic Studies Program at Observer Research Foundation, wrote in an article that, and I quote, China's strategy in the ongoing Ukraine crisis, as noted by some Chinese commentators, is actually to talk more and do less, and strike a fine balance between supporting Russia while also ensuring that its support for Russia does not provoke the US and the EU too much. China's official response so far encourages dialogue and negotiation between all parties, while also more or less sticking to the Russian position in the conflict, very much alludes to this strategy. Meanwhile, in China is watching this fiasco and saying to himself, well, if the most I have to fear is set of sanctions, then if I decide to take control of Taiwan, I am in good shape. Kishore.
So things are panning out pretty much well for China. Russia is suffering all the bad name. Russia is suffering
Mm-hmm.
the heft of the economic sanctions, and China actually getting a ringside view of the maximum damage that can ever happen.
Yeah, and then
And China is
since
in a far better shape than Russia.
yeah, I mean, since the COVID pandemic, there has been growing anger against China. I mean, also in the
Hmm.
last 4 years, like with the trade sanctions and stuff, like Trump upping the ante against China, that
Correct.
was the main bad actor. But now all that is lost. Now Russia takes center stage as enemy number one in the West. So China can sort of, it's better for them in theory because they can now glide under the radar in terms of the threat.
Hmm, hmm. Great. Okay. So we have now kind of looked at the present and how things have panned out, say in the past month and a half. But we also need to go back and look at how the crisis evolved right from the very beginning. So, Mohal, you want to give us a historical drawdown on the entire crisis?
Yeah, I mean, as I always say, like to understand these complex geopolitical situations, it's always good to take a step back in history to understand how this situation is like that we are in today. I mean, there is no one easy answer to it. I know,
Hmm.
like many on the, especially on social media, a lot of the pro-Russian people have been arguing, oh, it was the NATO expansion. Like it's like I think theory proposed by John Mersheimer. And while on the West, they say, oh, it's nothing to do with NATO expansion, which was kind of benign in their thought. And they said this is all to do, it's completely Russia's fault, and Putin is a megalomaniac who wants to like recreate the Russian Empire.
Hmm.
I mean, the truth, as in many times, it's somewhere in between. I mean, both sides do have a point, but let's just go step by step, like to how we arrived at the situation today. So basically, let's go start with NATO. So post World War II, the the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance was a military alliance of 20. I mean, at that time was started out with I believe like 12 members, if I'm not wrong, in 1949. And then later on, they started adding members as the Cold War went on. So in 1952, they added Greece and Turkey. In West Germany was added in 1955, and Spain in 1982 once they got rid of the dictator Franco. So that was the expansion up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, uh, the question opened up like whether NATO was going to stay put or like expand eastwards. Now, Putin, I mean, in many times has claimed over the past few years that uh, that's the then Secretary of State James Baker uh, had a famous line said, "Not 1 inch eastward," an assurance regarding the NATO expansion in his meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in February 1990. Now, this was part of a question of when the unification of Germany was on the table. The question was what happens to the East Germany, because there would be like Soviet soldiers stationed back then in the early 90s. So James Baker like verbally I mean, he claims that the not an inch eastward, it was a verbal assurance and it never meant that they NATO would never expand. Well, the Russians say no, it was, I mean, the truth is there is no written agreement. So even if there was a verbal assurance, I mean, there is no incentive for the Americans to say like, hey, you know what, like, I mean, there's no ironclad guarantees basically, as like Mr.
Hmm.
Baker put in for NATO's forces to go eastward. So the return agreement, what they did was just for related to Germany. There's nothing to what happened. Now after that, then in 1990, when the Berlin Wall falls, the Russia disintegrates into those the 16 different nations, and the Warsaw Pact is dissolved because there's no longer a Soviet Union. So there is a no. um, uh, de facto, like, second superpower to bind the Warsaw Pact together. Now, what happens next was interesting. So one of the in 1993, NATO was contemplating like admitting Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. So he proposed in an op-ed in Los Angeles Times that the alliance should consider a member Russia, which is Russia itself. Like, so Baker wrote back then, like, and echoed, for our relations with Russia, it cannot, it can both encourage reform and hedge our bets against a return to authoritarianism and expansionism. Now, mind you, like, this is before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Warsaw Pact. So it wasn't like, I mean, some people, I mean, it might sound outlandish today, but like they were proposed that why not you even include Russia in a pro-European, like, I mean, a seamless integration. But I guess that never came to be. And it fell by the wayside that like they could even possibly not only incorporate the Eastern European countries, but also Russia itself.
Mhm.
Kishore?
Okay, okay. So basically, the idea proposed by Baker was to encourage the nascent democracy that was blossoming in Russia itself and try to forever pull Russia into the ambit of the Western democracy. I think that was a revolutionary idea back then, but somehow obviously it never fructified. Anyway, so we'll move on. We'll keep looking at the history again, and we'll also have to look at how NATO expanded during the 1990s and early 2000s. 1990 June, during a session of the North Atlantic Council, the ministers of foreign affairs of NATO member states, they extended an invitation to the Warsaw Pact countries to cooperate in the spirit of freedom, democracy, and justice. So what happens? Within a year, in February 1991, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the most advanced countries in terms of implementing the reforms, they began to collaborate on European integration. And by December of the same year, December 1991, the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, NACC, was established. The members of the newly established Commonwealth of Independent States were also invited to join this forum. The NACC was expected to be a body allowing for cooperation on security issues between NATO and non-NATO countries. And by 2004, which was around 13 years after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, uh, along with Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, they kind of joined NATO. So this was in 2004. And in fact, the story of the Baltic nations joining NATO is quite interesting. What set the breakaway Baltics apart from other former Soviet republics is that shortly after regaining independence, they were clear eyed regarding their geopolitical predicament. They accurately assessed that the 1990s constituted a rare historical irregularity, a window of opportunity that would not last forever. Former Latvian President Vaira Fike-Freiberga, who shepherded Latvia through the membership process, attests that one of the principal lessons for small nations is that they always ought to stay vigilant, and when cracks in the march of history occur, immediately try to seize such moments. The Baltic leaders recognized that because of the relative weakness of Russia and the high watermark moment of American power, they were granted an unusual degree of political maneuvering. They acted without hesitation before Moscow clawed its way back into a stronger position. And now the Baltics were also eager to send their troops to UN missions as well as contribute to costly NATO operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Estonia, for example, participated in the Afghanistan mission without any national caveat, and they suffered one of the highest ratios of death per capita of any of the allied countries. Involvement in American led interventions was seen as an effective way to edge closer to NATO membership. So it was like the Baltics not only joined as quickly as they could, while the Russians were more focused inward. Uh, the Baltic nations were also very eager to prove themselves, even after becoming NATO members. So they would be the first to send soldiers. They would take maximum damage. They would lose more soldiers, so on and so forth, and it kind of ended up becoming as if their integration was complete and foolproof.
Yeah,
Now,
I think. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So I was done talking about the Baltic nations. I just wanted to switch over to
Yeah,
Ukraine, but you can
yeah. So I
make your
wanted to
point.
add little on the Baltic. So interestingly, back then, Denmark lead a peacekeeping battalion they created with the Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania.
Hmm.
So these countries, as you remember, post World War II, I mean, sorry, between World War One and World War II, they were all independent nations. So, but unfortunately, what happened is post World War II, they came in they were taken over by integrated into the then Soviet Union. So they saw a unique, as I said, like unique time in history where Soviet Union was not strong. So this was their opportunity to break away again and become independent, like they were between 1918 and 1945 in the interwar years.
Mm.
So they saw, and then they were eager to do whatever. I mean, interestingly, if you read the history behind it, like Latvia, like also signed a letter that hey, we want to join the NATO, which was like kind of unprecedented. And even many in the West were kind of confused because some of them were not sure like whether we should include like former Soviet
Mm.
republics or not. So it was also a very unique time and place in history, and they didn't have any um, love for them. Also, one more thing to remember, like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. So they were not only implementing reforms, which was one of a necessity to join NATO, but also remember, like in 1956, they had the Hungarian Revolution, and in Czechoslovakia, I think in 1960, there was an uprising which was brutally crushed by the Russians. So they had no love lost for the Russians. So when the time came, I mean, they wanted to throw their lot with the Western European nations and get out from the Russian sphere of influence. So many of these nations were eager to join the NATO. I
Mm.
mean, at first, many even in the West, even in the US administration back then, they were like wary of getting these people in because they were not sure like whether it would make sense. And obviously, the question of Russia getting upset, but even they were wary. But eventually, so it wasn't like NATO was, I mean, some people came was just wanting them to come along. I mean, obviously, if they came along, they didn't mind it. But many of these countries also wanted to get from under the Russian shadow. So they were like super eager to join NATO. And obviously, the unique place in history, as you very well described, helped them along. So now we came to the like how the Baltics and the everyone joined. Now we come up to Ukraine, now where it gets like a complex. Now Ukraine in 1994 was one, I think, was one of the largest country to have nuclear weapons on its soil. Now
Right.
in the Budapest Memorandum, basically they gave up their nuclear arms in exchange for like Russia to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now there are, I mean, you can see there are like countless examples of people who are well versed in foreign policy, international relations, who had warned about Ukraine being a red line for Russia. I mean, Russia, I think, in like the early 2000s was, I mean, it was also overshadowed by the events in 9/11 and the counterterrorism. So, and Russia not being as strong, they were, I think, not too happy, but they were not too opposed also to the Baltics joining it. But after that, I think they drew a red line in the sand that any more expansion is not going to happen, especially if it constitutes the former Soviet republics. So let's go through a few examples. I mean, George Kennan, who's been called one of the greatest foreign policy strategists, said in as far back as 1998 that NATO expansion would be a tragic mistake that ought to provoke a bad reaction from Russia. Henry Kissinger, like former Secretary of State, well known in all international policy circles, said that to Russia, Ukraine can never just be a foreign country, and then the West needs a policy that is aimed at reconciliation. He also was adamant that Ukraine should not join NATO. John Matlock, former US ambassador to the Soviet Union between 87 and 91, warned in 1997 that NATO expansion was the most profound strategic blunder. In a chain of events that could produce the most serious security threat since the Soviet Union collapsed. Bill Clinton's own Defense Secretary William Perry, in his memoir, said that the, the the rupture in relations to Russia, the NATO enlargement could cause a rupture in the relations with Russia, and he was so opposed to it. In the strength of my conviction, he also considered resigning. Um, Stephen Cohen, a famed scholar of Russian studies, warned in 2014 that if we move NATO forwards towards Russia's borders, it's obviously going to militarize the situation, and Russia will not back off because this is an existential threat for them. In her memoir, Madeleine Albright, who was a Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, concedes that Russian Boris President then Boris Yeltsin and his countrymen were strongly opposed to enlargement, seeing it as a strategy for exploiting their vulnerability and moving Europe's dividing line to the east, leaving them isolated. Strobe Talbot, the Deputy Secretary of State, similarly described the Russian attitude that many Russians see NATO as a vestige of the Cold War, inherently directed at the country. They pointed that since they have disbanded the Warsaw Pact, their military alliance, why not the West should do the same? Now, it was an excellent question that neither the Clinton administration or the successors could say, like, hey, the Warsaw Pact is gone. Why do we need a NATO alliance? But many of the smaller, and this is my point, like many of the NATO smaller countries, they had seen a lot of war in the two world wars, and they were subdued by like a larger power, be it Germany or Russia. So they always wanted a secure military alliance where any attack on them would be thing. But from Russia, who's a larger power, they would probably not see that this angle. Moscow's patience was also as the years went on, like with NATO's ever expansion, like was wearing thin. Famously, like around 15 years ago, exactly to the month, like March 2007, Putin addressed the annual Munich Security Conference, where he said, and I quote, "NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders." Putin complained NATO expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask against whom is this expansion intended, and what happened to the assurances that our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Western Pact. So there are like countless examples. Even like Secretary of State Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who served both under George Bush and Barack Obama, stated that the relationship with Russia was badly mismanaged after George H.W. Bush left office in 1993. And in an implicit rebuke to the younger Bush, Gates asserted that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. The move, he contended, was a case of recklessly ignoring what the Russians considered their own vital national interests. Even Russian President Boris Yeltsin had made an opposition to expansion in a 1995 speech. He said that those who insist on an expansion of NATO are making a major political mistake. The flames of war could burst out across the whole of Europe, he said. So we can go on, like it would. There are like countless examples when some people did see that maybe there would be a point at which Russia would say, okay, enough with the expansion, and we do not want it to go any more eastward, Kishor.
Right. So it's kind of obvious that Putin also showed quite a bit of restraint right from the time when the Baltic states joined NATO, and also the Velvet Revolution countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they all joined NATO. So somehow it looked like Putin ignored all these, and somehow Ukraine was the actual red line for Putin and Russia. Okay, so having said this, we now have to look at the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, and Ukraine's path to possible membership. The then President Bush, he strongly supported Ukraine and Georgia becoming NATO Action Plan members. However, this was opposed by United Kingdom, France, and Germany. The British argument was that although there is full support for both Ukraine and Georgia, the question of when they should join should remain in the balance. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Nicolas Sarkozy also were of the same opinion. The NATO alliance did not offer a membership action plan to Georgia or Ukraine, largely due to the opposition of Germany and France. But somehow they pledged to review the decision in December 2008. Now, even though Georgia was not offered MAP, it welcomed the decision and said the decision to accept that we are going forward to an adhesion to NATO was taken, and we consider this as a historic success. So, half a step forward itself was quite, it made Georgia happy. In fact, the summit declaration stated NATO's door, I quote, NATO's door will remain open to European democracies willing and able to assume the responsibilities and obligations of membership in accordance with Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. We reiterate that decisions on of enlargement are for NATO itself to make. NATO welcomes Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. Both nations have made valuable contributions to alliance operations. We welcome the democratic reforms in Ukraine and Georgia and look forward to free and fair parliamentary elections in Georgia in May. MAP, the Membership Action Plan, is the next step for Ukraine and Georgia on their direct way to membership. Today, we make clear that we support these countries' applications for MAP. Unquote. So, it was quite obvious that both Ukraine and Georgia were well on their way to full-fledged NATO membership. If not today, at least in a decade or 2 decades. Now, as all this was happening, there was a general perception in Ukraine which kind of changed to pro-EU and pro-NATO in the second half of 2000s. The then Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, he was a kind of a dubious character. In 2004, when he ran for presidency in the runoff elections, there were allegations of fraud during the runoff against his rival. Now, Viktor Yanukovych, after a series of street protests dubbed as the Orange Revolution, the voting had to be done, and in the second time around, Yushchenko was declared as the winner. So Viktor Yanukovych was he was almost at the cusp of power, but had to back off at the last minute. Now he bid his time and ran again for presidency, winning fairly in the next election in 2010. After this election in 2010, he used patronage and other instruments of state power in a flagrant fashion to the advantage of his own political party. That high-handed behavior and legendary corruption alienated large portions of Ukraine's population. As the Ukrainian economy languished and fell farther and farther behind those of Poland and other East European neighbors that had implemented significant market-oriented reforms, public anger at Viktor Yanukovych mounted. When he eventually rejected the European Union's terms for an association agreement in late 2013 in favor of a Russian offer, angry demonstrations filled Kiev's Independence Square, known as the Maidan, as well as other cities and towns within Ukraine. Now, at this point, Senator John McCain, the senior ranking Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, he went to Kiev to show solidarity with the Euromaidan activists. John McCain dined with opposition leaders. So this was kind of a direct meddling into the protests that were being seen in Ukraine at that point. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, also said that while the political crisis deepened, they also became involved in favoring the anti-Yanukovych demonstrators. Victoria Nuland noted in a speech to the US Ukraine Foundation in December 2013 that she had traveled to Ukraine 3 times in the week following the start of the demonstrations. Visiting the Maidan on December 5, she handed out cookies to demonstrators and expressed support for their cause. So all this was quite in the open, and the Russian intelligence intercepted and leaked to the international media a Newland telephone call in which she and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, discussing in detail their preferences for specific personnel in a post Yanukovych government. The US favored candidates included Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the man who became prime minister once Yanukovych was ousted from power. Now, in this telephone call, Victoria Nuland stated enthusiastically that Yatsenyuk is the guy who would do the best job. It was startling to have diplomatic representatives of a foreign country and a country that routinely touts the need to respect democratic processes and the sovereignty of other nations to be scheming about removing an elected government and replacing it with officials meriting US approval. Mohal?
Yeah, so I think this is like a very fascinating part that like I mean, just imagine if you take a example with India. Let's say if there were like protests were happening against the then UPA government in Ramlila Maidan in 2011. I mean, imagine if a US senator lands up in India and he says he throws his with like Anna Hazare and all the people who are protesting. I mean, to create a huge outcry in India. I mean, or let's say you take like the what Victoria Newland. Let's say if an assistant secretary uh, today like is like caught on tape discussing like who will be the best opposition leader like to after Modi. I mean, it would just generate an enormous amount of backlash. So a lot of people, I mean, including like Putin and Russians, were not too pleased. I mean, Yanukovych had his like faults and whatever things he mismanaged, and he didn't respect the will of the people who wanted to join the EU. But also the dealings that the US people had just, I think it just increased the animosity that Putin had for the West, who thought that they were actively interfering in Ukraine, which he considered in his sphere of influence. Kishore?
Agree. Yeah. So it was quite obvious that this issue of whether Ukraine should join NATO or not, ignoring Russian concerns, had now become a political debate within Ukraine. Now, the candidate during the 2010 presidential election and Party of Regions leader Viktor Yanukovych stated during the campaign that the current level of Ukraine's cooperation with NATO was sufficient and that the question of countries' accession to the NATO alliance was therefore not urgent. Uh, pre- uh, Once he was chosen and once he got elected and once he became the president, he kept repeating that Ukraine's relations with NATO were currently well defined and that there was no question of Ukraine joining NATO. He kept repeating that the issue of Ukrainian membership of NATO might emerge at some point, but we will not see it in the immediate future. So it was like Viktor Yanukovych kept kicking the football farther and farther into the future and hoping that he would never have to take the a difficult decision. However, once the protests erupted and he was forced to flee to Russia, in exile in December 2014, the Ukrainian parliament renounced Ukraine's non-aligned status and thus was harshly condemned by Russia. The new law stated that Ukraine's previous non-aligned status proved to be ineffective in guaranteeing Ukraine's security and protecting the country from external aggression and pressure, and also aims to deepen Ukrainian cooperation with NATO in order to achieve the criteria which are required for membership in the alliance. So by uh, pretty much the end of 2014, 29 December 2014, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko vowed to hold a referendum on joining NATO. Now, that's how things kept taking turn for the worse. And by 2017 June, Ukraine's leader Verkhovna Rada passed a law making integration with NATO a foreign policy priority. And in July 2017, Petro Poroshenko announced that he would seek the opening of negotiations on a membership action plan with NATO. And in the same month, again, President Poroshenko began proposing a patronage system tying individual regions with European states. And by March of 2018, NATO added Ukraine to the list of NATO aspiring members, which at that time also included Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia. And by 2020 June, while the world was in the grasp of COVID lockdowns, Ukraine joined NATO's Enhanced Opportunity Partner Interoperability Program. According to an official NATO statement, the new status does not prejudge any decisions on NATO membership. So it's quite obvious that step by step, Ukraine was getting closer and closer to a NATO membership. Now, by September 2020, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, there were elections and uh, Zelensky was now the new president. He approved Ukraine's new national security strategy, which provided for the development of the distinctive partnership with NATO with the aim of membership in NATO itself. And by October 2020, during a meeting with Prime Minister Boris Johnson in London, President Zelensky stated that Ukraine needed a NATO membership action plan, as NATO membership will contribute to Ukraine's security and defense. Mohal?
Yeah, so I think especially after the then President Yanukovych in the protest forced him to flee to Russia. I think what Russia said, like that they saw the interference from the western side in Ukraine, and he forcibly annexed Crimea, which was like loudly condemned by, I think, and then Russia was also kicked out of the G8 back then, which is now a G7. They were not like very too harsh sanctions, but like some of the individuals were sanctioned back then. So I mean, there was I think Putin in his mind thought like maybe with NATO, if Ukraine will join NATO, the Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet. I mean, Russia did have like soldiers as per an agreement put on Ukraine soil in Crimea with the Black Sea Fleet, and he thought that it would come under some danger, so he went ahead and annexed Crimea, which was like loudly condemned with by all countries in the world. Now what I wanted to say like is that the NATO situation of with Ukraine, I mean, it just left it hanging to for a very long time. I mean, Russia was able to exploit that one. So earlier, as you say, in Bucharest in 2008, they said, oh, you can join us, but they didn't even put them on a membership action plan, which was weird that until 2020 for like 12 years you would want a member but not even put him on a membership action plan. So the Europeans were kind of divided, and then on the other hand, they were not able to arm the Ukrainians so much that they can deter a Russian invasion. So I mean, as in Hindi, we have that saying like, na dhobi ka na ghat ka situation. I think that was exactly what NATO did. They neither said that, okay, you are welcome to join, let's put you on a membership action plan and you can join in, let's say, years. a certain number of years, while you also don't give them a security guarantee. And this is where Russia could exploit it to invade it to make sure that it remains in their sphere of influence. Also, one of the things sets this apart from the other NATO members in Eastern Europe was that the some of the, as I said before, like see in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they had bitter memories of the 1956 Prague Spring and 68 revolt being crushed by the Soviet Union. So they had no love lost for Russia. Even when I read up like during their accession to NATO, there was very little public opposition. While in Ukraine, it's different, right? I mean, there is a western part of Ukraine which is very pro EU, which is always wanted to go towards EU and NATO, while the eastern part, the Donbass region especially, like they are like Russian speakers and they don't have that much affinity. So you have the European ambitions. You don't put Ukraine on a NATO membership action plan to join. You left them hanging for so many years. You don't arm them enough. So everything combined together, and then you have like political divisions within Ukraine. I mean, even if you think of it, like up till 2008, maybe they were joining Ukraine. Then you have Yanukovych from 2010 to 14, where they said he doesn't want to join Ukraine. So there's political division. There's not even a consensus in the Ukraine whether they want to join NATO or not. So all these factors combine to create the perfect storm where they could neither join and they were just left hanging for a very long time. I think that's what explains, I mean, like the Russian angle, the European angle, the NATO angle, the Ukraine angle. I mean, everything combined to create this crisis at the moment. Kishore?
Perfect, perfect. Okay, so that kind of explains how complex the entire situation is, and how it's quite obvious that both sides are guilty of acts of commission and acts of omission. Anyway, now we'll come back to the Indian perspective, and we'll try to see how Indians have been doing a tightrope walk. And we'll also have to look at how the Indians have chosen the path that they have eventually taken. Now, remember, if you have listened to us in our previous episodes, we have mentioned about the law that the U.S. Senate has passed, which is actually called CATSA, Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which essentially is an act, a law, to counter American adversaries like Russia, like China, through sanctions. And not only would it impose sanctions on Russia or China, it would also impose sanctions on anybody having any kind of transactions with Russia. So, for example, if India has any transactions being done with Russia, then through law, through the CATSA law, American government is well within their right to impose sanctions even on a country like India. So that is the kind of dichotomy that India faces. The people like I mean, countries like India face, especially because India has bought the air defense system called the S-400, which again we have talked in one of our previous episodes, wherein India tried evaluating quite a few potential air defense systems and eventually chose S-400 over over other options from the US like THAAD, like Patriot, so on and so forth. And that kind of left the Americans red-faced because they were kind of arm twisting Indians to go ahead and procure the Patriot missiles or THAAD missiles. And eventually, Indians did not budge, and they purchased the S-400 air defense system. So this was kind of the latest round of uh, I mean, ill will between the US and India. However, having said that, the Indo-Russian relations have been on for a long time, ever since India became independent. So obviously, India has a very good reason as to why it does not want to alienate the Russians. After all, another problem is that the US tries to arm twist, not to buy not to buy arms and ammunition from Russia, But the US itself refuses to sell to India any top of the line equipment themselves. So the F-35 or the submarine, the nuclear submarines, I think all of them are off the shelf when it comes to any kind of defense deal that the US wants India to enter with them. So that's the kind of dichotomy that India keeps facing. Now, having said that, the Indian leadership itself has been in constant touch with both the Russian and Ukrainian leaderships. India has now, after having pretty much evicted most of its students, has now announced an aid package for Ukraine. Again, it has to be remembered that vast majority of Indian military hardware is of Russian origin. Again, we have spoken about it in our previous episodes, roughly about 60 to 70%. Now, this large amount of equipment implies that you will obviously need a lot of spares or ammunition, again, to be imported from Russia on a regular basis. In fact, as per one report in Economic Times, as per one estimate, the annual outgo for spares and parts from Russia for the armed forces in itself is in excess of around $500 million. So uh, that's how like how India did with the Iranians when Iran itself was trying to struggle when Iran itself was struggling with sanctions imposed on them. India entered into an agreement directly with Iran to have a direct real to rupee transaction, similar to how we are now talking about a ruble to rupee transaction. And this way, India entered into trade with Iran by assigning certain banks, which did not have so much of exposure to the Western banking system. And I think India would want to repeat the same process again by earmarking a few Indian banks which do not have so much of exposure to Western banking system to have some kind of a direct ruble to rupee transaction. But I think having said all that, the biggest takeaway for any India watcher would be India's reluctance to publicly admonish Russia. As much as India would claim that uh, the territorial integrity of Ukraine has to be respected, India pretty much refuses to not only toe the Western line in voting against Russia in the United Nations, but also to announce imposition of harsh sanctions. Mohal? So yeah, that's about
Yeah,
the
yeah. I
type
mean,
of work that the Indians are doing. Now, do
mhm.
you want to
Yeah,
add
actually,
anything?
let me. Yeah, I want to add here. So, couple of points here. I mean, you very well brought up the reliance on military hardware. Now, some people say like, okay, why can't we use Western weapons now? Even if Western weapons, the deals have signed, it takes years and years for them to come over. So, we will have to rely on Russian hardware for the near future for sure. Um, so we have to get those spares. Otherwise, we'll be stuck. Especially when we have a situation at the LAC with China, we cannot afford to not have those weapons come in. Regarding like the Russian military, also, I mean, you have to remember that certain things like leasing a nuclear submarine, even high tech, even stuff, even like the Americans don't give it to us. So it's not like India is going to break relations with Russia. I mean, that's relates to the strategic autonomy that India has been practicing for a very long time. And also regarding like, I mean, there has been some reluctance from India and many Western commentators, and even like Prime Minister Modi's critics in India have been saying, "Oh, why is India not criticizing Modi? I mean, Modi is like Putin's best friend, and he likes autocratic leaders. That's why he's very uh, chummy with them, and he doesn't want to." But it's not that. See, even in 2014, when the previous government under Manmohan Singh was there, where then National Security Advisor, I believe Shiv Shankar Mohan, right? Sorry, I get his name
Shiv
wrong.
Shankar Menon, yeah.
Yes, Shiv Shankar Menon. Sorry, Menon. I mean, when he was asked about the Crimean annexation, I mean, he didn't give a straightforward answer that he uh, um, is opposed to it. I mean, sort of. I mean, he said like the Russian interests also have to be in balance. So it's not a political thing that Modi is not speaking out, because it's like an old political practice. Even the previous government during the Crimean annexation didn't speak out as vocally, because India does have its interest. It needs to balance. Plus, also a lot of students were stuck initially, so you couldn't trying to get any anger anybody regarding it.
Okay, so that kind of elaborates on the Indian angle. Now, Mohal, you have any closing thought?
Yeah, so see, like Putin, I mean, we said like he might have some grievances like regarding the NATO expansion, and he wanted to retain his sphere of influence. Now, obviously, smashing a country to pieces is not the right way to do it. I mean, he might have his grievances, but starting a war where so many innocent lives are lost. I mean, today, like Ukraine reported that around 1,300 soldiers. I mean, Zelensky said that might have lost their lives. So it's not very looked upon well. I mean, anytime in the post World War II global order, when you arbitrarily change international boundaries or invade other nations, it's frowned upon or looked up at very badly. So it's not a doesn't look good. I mean, as you said earlier, Putin has lost a lot of world support by doing this, by starting an unprovoked war, which I don't think anybody in the world is almost like supporting it. Might people might understand the reasons he did it, but the loss of life and the refugee crisis and everything has created a lot of anger against him. Now, Putin might have miscalculated the economic backlash from the West. I mean, in 2014, when he had the annexed Crimea, I mean, the sanctions were like kind of a slap on the wrist. So he thought, you know what, I'll get away again with it. Also, uh, the US failure, I mean, in Afghanistan, and also you might think that there was a decline in the US relative power, might have thought, oh, this was the right time to pounce upon Ukraine. Now, what is Putin's endgame is, I mean, nobody really knows. I mean, he can, after the fall of Kiev, in theory, install a friendly government with somebody like a Yanukovych, where he could withdraw and then say, you know what, I achieved my game, I achieved my aim. Like, I have a pro-Western Ukrainian government who will, like, not toe the Westland and join NATO. Now, trying to because I mean, if you think about the alternative, trying to capture the whole of country as big as Ukraine is going to be, and especially given the current progress, it's going to be very slow and difficult. And then the longer this goes on, the probability of turning into a long bloody insurgency also increases. I mean, at this point, I would say like the most probable outcome is like a long bloody insurgency in Ukraine. I mean, Putin will be looking for an off ramp. I mean, they did have some discussions with Zelensky, but I don't think they can come up to a conclusion. I mean, in theory, Zelensky, I mean, Biden might just tell him not to accept any peace deal where, let's say, Russia, in theory, gets a pledge from Ukraine not to join NATO. But that's been his whole thing all along, that, we want Ukraine to not join NATO. But I mean, Biden could say, like, Zelensky, don't accept the offer, because that would set a bad precedent for the future where, like, any aspiring member in the NATO alliance, let's say a Moldova in the future, which is neither part of NATO nor part of any other alliance, would be invaded by a rival great power just to force their hand to not join the rival alliance. I mean, it would just be a bad precedent. Now, the invasion on the European side has galvanized NATO and EU like never before in the past 10, 15 years. I mean, there was a lot of divisions within EU. You had the Brexit, and even the NATO members couldn't agree upon. I mean, Trump did upbraid them quite harshly for not spending enough on defense, now which they have finally woken up to doing, like spending more on defense. Now, Ukraine is like a complex situation, right? I mean, on the western part, you have pro-EU sympathies, and they have anger at Russia, which would have just grown exponentially after they got invaded. So they were never going to accept a de facto Russian control. Now, let's say even if Kiev falls, which it could be given the large amount of Russian forces surrounding it, and even if a pro-Russian leader is installed, I mean, half the country to the west is not bound to accept him as a legitimate leader. So any long drawn insurgency is not going to be good. I mean, it will just shatter the Ukrainian state. Like, uh, I mean, it just runs the risk of becoming a failed nation in the long run. But also, it also brings about the security dimensions and implications for Europe and rest of the world. Now, I mean, firstly, an estimated 2.5 million refugees have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries like Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Now, many of these nations already had, over the last maybe few years, dealing with a huge influx of refugees from Syria, Turkey, Afghanistan, etc. So the additional burden is going to put even more pressure on their finances, especially when we're coming out of an economic recession post corona pandemic. Also, the issue of foreign fighters, right? I mean, there are like thousands of foreign fighters have streamed towards Ukraine to fight on their behalf. I mean, which is a noble cause for the Ukrainians who are getting invaded by a larger power. But see, like this risk becoming a breeding ground for extremism, as seen in different parts of the world. I mean, you have Afghanistan and Syria and lot of so many cases. I mean, Ukraine has been practically flooded with all kinds of anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to help them fight the Russians. Now, due to the crisis, they've been handed out liberally to whoever wants to like pick up a fight with Russians. But there remains a risk that some of these weapons could end up in the wrong hands via black market, which will have like a security implications in the future. I mean, they could be, God forbid, like target used to target a civilian airliner in the future. I mean, so there could be a misuse. I mean, I remember that after 9/11, like I mean, US was actively paying, I think, like 10 or $50,000 to actively procure all the stingers that they'd given the Mujahideen in the Soviet invasion days. So they didn't want their airplanes to get down, so they had to go and buy back all of them at a steep price. So I mean, this is like what I mean. The world um has thrown the kitchen sink in terms of, I mean, moving on to the sanctions part of it. The world has thrown the kitchen sink in terms of sanctions against Putin to bring him down now, which might not bring him down. But like, if you think of the angle of China, I mean, Xi is getting a free look at the playbook. I mean, he's getting all the trick plays, all the stuff that they would do. Like, let's say, even if she would to make even a move on Taiwan, he just knows how to foolproof all his sanctions because he has been given the practically the whole playbook, right? I mean, that was some people say like, you should not have bared the whole playbook for China because now China knows exactly what to do to prevent any kind of sanctions against it for let's say if it goes for Taiwan in the future. Now, coming to the last point, like the Indian angle, I think the lesson for conflict of India has been self-dependence in weapons tech. Now, because the threat of weapons or spares being slowed down or stopped in the sanctions. Now, the government and Prime Minister Modi has like pushed for Atmanirbharta or self-reliance in defense manufacture. I think which should get a necessary fillip given the trouble that we could have over the next few years procuring any kind of Russian equipment or supplies. And also the Ukraine, I think delivers one more important example for us in foreign policy, international relations. Now, Ukraine, I mean, as I said, na Dobika na Gatka, like never got any explicit security guarantees that okay, if Russia invades, we will come fight for you, or nor they entered any military alliance. So the lesson for India is like if push comes to shove against, let's say, a bigger power like or hegemon like China, we will be practically on our own. I mean, nobody's going to come fight for us. I mean, you can't have like Russia, US troops, even if they support India, fighting for us on the LAC, for example. I mean, we have to fight our own battles, that's for sure. And given our culture of strategic autonomy, no matter who's in power, may it be Modi or a Congress government or a third front, nobody, we're never going to sign an explicit military alliance with the Americans where in case of attack, they would come and help us out. So we have to fight on our own. I think that's a given. And this just highlights that point one more time that we have to rely on ourselves to stand up to a larger power such as China. Kishore?
Great point, Mohal. Now, from my perspective, my closing comment would be that for the US also, this is a needless conflict that they are getting into at the back of the longest war that they have fought. The Afghan retreat was a huge embarrassment for the US and also for their allies. Also, they haven't stood up to their own promise of rehabilitating all Afghan contractors and other supporters who were working with the US in Afghanistan. At this kind of a juncture, the US making any tall promises about how they will stand shoulder to shoulder with with the Ukrainian people will be met with lots of suspicion. Also, it is important to understand that this is a period of geopolitical churn. Iran is being wooed by the US and its allies to tackle inflationary concerns by allowing Iranian crude oil into the global markets, hoping that inflation can be handled decisively. However, every such attempt by the US is being met with apprehension by regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The US hopes that the Iranian oil can act as a direct substitute to the sanctioned Russian crude oil. Now, along with this, uh, the Americans' stated aim was to strengthen their presence in the Indo-Pacific arena, Indo-Pacific theater. Now, any kind of distraction that happens in Europe, in Ukraine, is actually a major distraction for them simply because they cannot focus on Indo-Pacific region, and that gives the Chinese enough time for them to grow stronger and to strategize as much as they want in either taking up Taiwan or in getting into any other mischief that they want to get into. So this kind of a distraction does not bode well for any nation within the Indo-Pacific theater. So these are the kind of concerns that throw up as part of the Russian invasion of Ukraine right now. Now, before we end this episode, again we reiterate that our hearts and prayers are with the Ukrainian people who are now facing a Herculean crisis. Hopefully, there will be a quick end to this crisis, and the Ukrainians can get back to rebuilding their nation. Now, having said this, I think we'll have to move on to our recommendations. And Mohal, you have your recommendation for the week?
Yeah, so I listened to this excellent Orion Talks podcast where Paul Post he elaborates on his agreement with John Mersheimer's arguments regarding West responsibility in the NATO expansion in the crisis, and his agreements and both his agreements and disagreements regarding uh, like whether the West was responsible for this crisis and whether Russia was responsible. I think he gives a very balanced take where it's kind of mixed bag where little bit of blame on both sides. Obviously, I want to state again, like Russia invading that the war is obviously on the responsibility lies with Russia, but from a historical perspective, who gets more of the blame? And I think it's kind of a mixed bag. It's neither here nor there. So, Kishore, what's your recommendation for this week?
Okay, yeah. My recommendation is an article written in the Indian Express by a person named D.B. Venkatesh Verma, titled Harsh Lessons from the Ukraine Crisis. In fact, he tells that the confrontation will drag the US down into a quagmire, and what starts in Europe will not stay in Europe. So he kind of is of the opinion that this might actually spill over far beyond the boundaries of Europe, and India and the US might have to be ready for that kind of a expanded theater. Having said that, there are equal concerns of China's role in all this, and that is where the US might suddenly find its hands full in dealing with both Russia and China. So that will be my recommendation for this week. Okay, so as we wind up, uh, there is a note for the listeners as well. So to continue hearing about such interesting topics, we would urge you to subscribe to our channel India Rising wherever you are listening to us. If you are listening to us on YouTube, do press the bell icon to get notifications about new episodes. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. Until the next time, this is Mohal and Kishor signing off.